This is Ray Varner, class of 2010, in Norfolk, Virginia, on July 11th, 2011, and we're here with the Living Legacies Oral History Program with the Women of Randolph-Macon Oral History Program. And we're here today. The interviewee will be Pat Hanback of 1975, and then also here is Claire Stevens and Sarah Hendricks from the Development Office. Hello, Pat.
Hello, Ray.
Okay, so how did you first hear about Randolph-Macon?
The headmaster in my high school was the one who brought Randolph-Macon to my attention. The college had sent out some flyers announcing that they were going to go co-ed in, I guess it was the fall of 70, 71, and he was the one that brought it to my attention. So my parents did not want me to go to college up in the New England area. They did not approve of the boy that I was dating at the time, who happened to be up there, and so they told me I could go west or I could go south.
Where did you grow up?
In New Jersey.
So what was your headmaster's connection to the college?
He really didn't have any. The flyer came out, and he said, "This is interesting. It's a college that is going co-ed. They're looking apparently for 50 women to start the freshman class. You might be interested." And it was an all-girls prep school. I had been in the prep school for the last 2 years of high school, and I wanted desperately to be back in a co-ed environment.
So do you remember anything about that pamphlet, what it said, or maybe do you remember your impressions of the pamphlet, or just...
It seems to me it was just a flyer of some kind. I don't recall it being a pamphlet.
Okay. So can you tell us anything about your first trip to campus?
First time I came to campus would have been in the summer before freshman year. I'd already been accepted and had accepted the acceptance at that point, and they invited the women to come to campus for a weekend to just see what the college was like. They put us up in Mary Branch dorm. There were maybe 15, 20 male students from one or two of the fraternities that were on campus that threw some parties for us while we were there. But that was the first time I had seen it. I accepted before ever seeing the campus.
So what were your impressions?
It seemed like a very long drive to get here from New Jersey. And the thing that stood out to me as we were coming down 95 were the loblolly pines, which there just aren't a bunch of them up where I grew up. And it just kind of was like, are these the only trees that grow in Virginia? Because that's all you could see coming down the interstate. And then when we pulled off into Ashland, I thought, wow, I wonder what I've done here. Because there wasn't a whole lot in Ashland back then. There was the Henry Clay Shopping Center, and there was, I believe, a 7-Eleven. It was there. There was a little High's ice cream store that was on the corner where you turned into the college. But other than that, there just wasn't much there. And turned into the campus and thought, kind of out in the middle of nowhere.
So of the actual campus itself, what did you think about it?
I liked the old buildings, the look of them. Now, a lot of them were in pretty serious disrepair back then, but I'm into historical buildings and antiques and things, and so I liked that a lot. And it didn't seem like it was a big campus. It definitely, my kids both went to Virginia Tech, and when I took them up there, I was just overwhelmed by the size of that school. And I never felt overwhelmed on the Randolph-Macon campus. It was very nice and homey.
You talked about the old buildings. This is kind of a tangent, but do you remember the old gym?
Yes.
So can you tell us anything?
I think it's terrible that we tore it down. Absolutely awful. It had graffiti all over it, but it was historical graffiti, old scores from different games. And then I want to say, yeah, it was even in my freshman year, there was one section of it that had been walled off where they had the student mailboxes. And so you went to the old gym virtually every day to go get, pick up your mail. And then by the time my senior year, I guess it was maybe gone at that point. Yeah, they had torn it down. But before they tore it down, they had moved art classes into that building. And big, beautiful windows with wonderful, natural sunlight coming in. Jack Witt was teaching art classes in that building. I can't believe we tore it down for Brown Campus Center, no less.
Yeah. So going back to the questions, so you said you were at an all-girls school, and you said you wanted to go co-ed, but did the fact that the school, what bearing on your decision did the fact that the school had just gone co-ed have on your decision?
Probably a lot, and I can't say I was totally serious when I sent the application in. The headmaster in my school was very much always pushing for graduates of my high school to end up at one of the Ivy League schools up in New England, and he did not agree with my parents, obviously, and just he's like, I bet you they'll say no to this, and maybe they'll let you go ahead and apply to Smith or whatever else, because it's so overwhelmingly men as opposed to women. And what happened was my father went and started researching Randolph-Macon and realized the school had been around for years and years, and it had the Methodist church connection, although we weren't Methodist. That meant something to him, and he considered it, probably a fairly conservative school, and it had a good academic reputation. And so he said, okay, you can apply. And I sent the application in. It was literally within 2 weeks. Not only did I have an acceptance letter in the mail, but I had put on the application that I was interested in majoring in political science. And Bruce Unger, who was head of the political science department, made a phone call to me to talk to me and try and encourage me to come to Randolph-Macon. And then I got a second phone call from Warner, who was the soccer and swim coach. I don't know what else he was coaching back then, but I do remember he was coaching those two things. And so, I had two people reaching out to me from the faculty, plus this quick acceptance. I went, these people really must want me a lot. Maybe I should go there. And that was kind of what put me over the edge.
Did you apply to other schools as well?
Yeah, I applied to William & Mary, and I was put on the wait list at William & Mary. I was on a wait list at UNC. William & Mary said they had already reached their quota of out-of-state students. I'd applied to the University of Pennsylvania, hadn't heard anything from them, and I really didn't want to go to University of Pennsylvania anyway. And it was just, this quick response where I'd had these two wait lists that, that it sends you a mixed message, and then another school that I really didn't want to go to. And so I'll take my chance. These people clearly want me. And it just seemed like a fun thing to be doing, too. To be going to a school that was just going co-ed. And, great odds if you want to be back in a co-educational environment. It was, 750 men, I think, and 50 women. It was kind of I like those odds.
So what was that time like when all the girls got together before school? You said they put you a Mary Branch. Do you remember anything else about that experience?
I remember, and I honestly, I wouldn't say her name if I could remember it, but they paired us up with roommates. So, we didn't each have our own separate room in Mary Branch. And the person they paired me up with was from the deep South. And I can remember, they gave us linens. We had to make our own beds. It was kind of like, we want you to see what it's going to feel like living on a college campus. And they gave us, 2 straight sheets. There was no fitted flat sheet for the bottom. And she had never made a bed in her life. And so I had to help her make her bed. And then we got through making the beds, and she looked at me and said, "Do you by any chance have a pin I could borrow?" And I assumed she was talking about a safety pin or a straight pin. And so I went rummaging in my stuff and handed her a safety pin, and she said, "No, I mean a pin, like what you write with." And that was my impression of the roommate situation. And I'm trying to think what else. There was another girl from my prep school who was in my class, Mimi De Silva, and she had actually ridden down with us so that the 2 families wouldn't both have to make the trip down for that. So it wasn't like I was totally alone. I did know somebody who was there that weekend. But other than that, it was a big culture shock because I think there were so many more Southern females as opposed to us Northerners.
Would you say that most of the girls came from the South, or you give a ratio?
Yeah.
Most? Okay. Don't mean to get too...
As I'm recalling, back in those years, there was a preponderance of students from Virginia and maybe North Carolina and the lower Maryland, D.C. area. And I think that the females kind of mirrored that. I could be wrong on that, but that's my impression.
So I guess you went back home because that was only a trip when you were there for a little bit, right?
Yes.
And then, so what was it like coming back, as an actual freshman? I guess you went through another orientation period, or did you get back earlier than everybody else?
The thing that stood out there, of course, you're bringing trunks and all kinds of stuff. And not a whole lot of students had cars back then. My parents drove me down from New Jersey again. The car was packed with all my stuff. And some of the upperclassmen were on campus, had come back early, not just because they needed to be there for athletics, but because they were interested in getting a first look at the females. And they lined themselves up in front of Mary Branch on that brick wall, and there was just a bunch of them. And then, they'd see another car roll up, and 4 or 5 of them would come running over to ask if they could help carry the stuff into the dorm so that, they could get a feel for the women that were going to be on campus. I'm not sure that answered your question, but that was my first impression was, wow, look at all these guys. And you just kind of felt like, okay, it's a little bit of a fishbowl here. And they literally, for a few weeks, were camping out constantly on that front, wall. They would just sit there. There'd be 15 or 20 of them. And they're watching as you came out of the dorm. They were watching you as you were coming back in. And you were just kind of on parade.
Did you acknowledge them? Did you?
Yeah. And, some of them were just there and they looked and, they weren't real friendly. And then others attempted to engage you. And one of the
catcalling, it wasn't like a line of construction workers.
Well, kind of, in a way, that's what it was like. Was actually one of those guys who camped out on the wall. His name was Bob Conroy. He was a senior. And he got me engaged in a conversation and said, what do you like to do? And, there weren't enough females to really, host a sports team a female sports team of any kind. I think eventually there were a couple that played tennis and maybe some golf, but I had never played either one of those sports before, going to college. And he was the captain of the swim team, and he said, "We need a manager for the swim team. You think you'd be interested?" And I loved the water and loved swimming, and I said, "Sure." And so he marched me over, and I got to meet Coach Warner, up front and personal instead of over the phone. And he said, "I don't know if we could have a female manager." And it was all men on the swim team. And a couple of the guys on the team rallied around and said, "I don't see why she couldn't be a manager." And it did, and I became the swim team manager. And the first issue came up when they had the first away meet, where they were going to have to be away overnight, and President White said, "She can't go." And again, the team rallied around and said, "She's our manager, she has to go." And so I had my very own hotel room. But they stood up for the fact that I needed to be there because I was part of the team.
So they treated you pretty well. The men did.
Yeah, I thought so.
Did they treat you like one of the guys, or did they
Yeah,
definitely were
yeah.
different? So this might be a random question, but do you remember the food? What it was like?
I thought the food was okay. We had an awful lot of food fights. And I mean, major, where, food was flying all over the cafeteria and people complaining. But like Sunday mornings, they were cooking steak, and, that was a big deal. And there weren't a lot of kids that stuck around on campus because there were so many of them that, lived in Virginia and could get home for the weekend. And so the place would clear out, and there'd maybe be only a quarter of the student body there, but you got fed really well on the weekends. And I thought the food was okay. I mean, I would not have been throwing food around the cafeteria because I didn't think it was good. I could always find something to eat. Nothing like what students have now, which to me is just pretty incredible. And when I hear them complaining, I think, you need to go back to the 1970s and see what we were being fed if you don't think you have enough choice.
So the food fight you think it was more of a political food fight? It was a protest food fight.
It was a protest food fight that the food was terrible and that they needed to upgrade the food service. And they actually, I think, changed the food service vendor somewhere in that term at least once, maybe twice.
Yeah, Mike Carter's.
And then there was Lester Jackson, who he worked in the cafeteria. He was just the nicest man. He knew everybody by name. I mean, I just couldn't imagine throwing food all over the cafeteria when you had somebody like that, behind the line working.
Who was your roommate your freshman year? Because
I
it
didn't
wasn't
have-
the same person.
I didn't have a roommate my
Okay.
freshman year. I was in a private room. The second year, it was Lou Ann Davis.
Just curious.
Yeah. Ryan now, I think, is her last name.
So I guess that's a good segue. So can you tell us about your social life? So what you did, who were your friends, and
I hung out at the fraternities a lot.
Anyone in particular?
KA became the favorite. And I dated more KA guys than anybody else. Kappa Sig was my second favorite. I tended to gravitate over there, but we did a lot of partying at Phi Delta too. But yeah, I would say the fraternities were definitely the focus socially. There was always a party going on, and you just gravitated over to the fraternities. There weren't no sororities.
Were you a little sister of any of them? Was that just your choice not to be a little sister, or were there little sisters at that time?
I don't think so. If there were, I don't think it was official.
Okay. So you say that the fraternities were the focus. Can you describe what it was like, what the fraternity parties were like in that day?
Do I have to? Yeah. There was a lot of drinking, for sure. Any of the big weekends, Camptown weekend, homecoming, there were probably 2 or 3 other times during the year. I mean, those are the ones that stand out for me in the fall and in the spring. But they'd have bands, live bands that would come in, and you'd dance, and there were big, huge trash cans full of grain, alcohol, and the upperclassmen were supplying the liquor, and there were other things that were probably not so legal that were generally around too.
You mentioned. Sorry.
And you went from one fraternity house to the other too. I mean, when one did it, almost all of them did it, and so you could go down fraternity row, and if you wanted to, you could spend time at 6 or 7 different parties in one night.
And the boys themselves, I mean, the KAs would go to the Phi.
Oh, yeah.
The boys themselves would.
Yeah.
Fraternity boys.
Yeah. They'd hang out most of the time at their own house, but then, it was, I need to go over and spend some time at the Phi Delts, and you'd find Phi Delts over at KA, and, they mixed and mingled all around, and, whoever had the best band at the time and the biggest crowd dancing, and a lot of them would end up there.
You mentioned Camptown. So what was Camptown like?
It was like a mini Woodstock, is the only way I can describe it. You'd get in the car, and as I'm recalling, it was probably, I don't know, only 3 or 4 miles up Route 1 to get to that racetrack. But it would take you a couple hours because there was so much traffic going to Camptown. And they would bus people in from VCU and, other big U of R, and they'd come from the western part of the state. I mean, it was a big deal, and kids from all over the place showed up for that thing. And then you sat there, it was in a natural bowl, and you'd sit up on the grass slopes of that bowl and just get drunk as all get out, sitting out there in the sun. And, there would be people doing some cooking and stuff, but not a whole lot. It was mostly just drinking, and you'd watch this, the horse races, and it would go on for a couple hours, and then you'd go back to campus, and you had all the big parties at the fraternity houses that night. You had parties the night before, that Friday, before the races on Saturday. And then Sunday, the fraternities would all organize more parties in the afternoon. I can remember going down to, I guess it was the South Anna River, and camping out on somebody's farmland that backed up to the river, and we'd go tubing in the river and cook food and, do more drinking and carrying. I mean, it was like a party that was nonstop from Friday afternoon after classes let out until late Sunday night. It was a big deal weekend.
And it was at the end of the semester, or at the spring
It was
semester?
in the springtime.
Okay. Homecoming. So, do you remember that first year, 1975? Do you remember who won, or do you remember anything about that?
1971.
Oh, sorry, 71. I'm sorry. I don't know.
Honestly, I don't remember who won at any of this.
It was. See, what?
You could ask me.
I know, that was a tough question.
Yeah. It was like, I mean, you.
And I'm sorry.
I wouldn't be able to tell you who won the Randolph-Macon-Hampton-Sydney game in any of those years. Other than that was a big deal. That was another big party weekend, was the Hampton-Sydney weekend. But who won? I don't even
Becky-
know who
Becky-
we played.
Becky Firth won the homecoming in
Yes,
1970.
now I do remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was
Bob Garrity was her escort, and she ended up marrying him. They were high school sweethearts and stayed sweethearts all through college and ended up being married.
Yeah. The reason why I bring that up is because I was wondering, because I saw an article in the Yellow Jacket, the newspaper, and it said that it was a big deal because a girl from Randolph-Macon won. And apparently some of the fraternities had nominated girls from outside, some nominated girls from inside.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you got to think about it. You had 750 men and only 50 women. The odds weren't so great for the guys, and a lot of them, particularly the seniors and the juniors, were used to making road trips up to Mary Washington and some of the other female colleges, and they had been dating women from those colleges for years. So yeah, I would say there were more non-Randolph-Macon women vying for homecoming queen than there were otherwise. In fact, I'm not sure if maybe Becky was not the only female Randolph-Macon student that was in the running.
Do you think people voted for her because she went to Randolph-Macon? Or was it...
Oh, she was just a wonderful girl, and she very attractive and nice personality, well liked. And I'm guessing maybe, although I can't say for certain, that she probably got a number of votes because she was a Randolph-Macon student. And there were a number of male students, very supportive of the females, that would have, I think, pushed for that.
Did you yourself want a woman from Randolph-Macon to win over someone from the outside?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and it was a little frustrating that so many of the guys continued to road trip. I look back on it now as an adult and realize why that was the case, but you show up on campus and it's like, why are all you guys taking off every weekend? Hello? Did you notice us? Remember us from when you were sitting on the wall in front of Mary Branch?
So you lived in Mary Branch that first year? Did you live there every year, or did you?
I was in Mary Branch for the first 3 years. And then they had admitted enough women. We started out, we only had 2 wings of Mary Branch. And there were still men in the other wing. I'm trying to remember. I think they were in the North Wing, maybe, our freshman year. Might have been the South Wing. They didn't have enough of us to fill up all of Mary Branch. And then the second year, they admitted, I want to say it was another 50 women. We ended up with all of Mary Branch. And by the time I was a junior, they had given us what they were calling New Dorm. And so you had women over there. And the house mother in New Dorm was a lot more strict than the one we had in Mary Branch. And besides, I just liked the older dorm and the big, huge windows with all the sunlight. Had absolutely no desire to move out. By the time I was a senior, they had run out of room again, and they gave us an option, not all of us, but gave us an option to live off campus. And so Luann and I rented an apartment across the railroad tracks. It was just catty corner. If you went down to the main intersection, it's England Street, I guess, right? And was catty corner to that. They had built some townhouses, and we rented one of those and lived in that senior year. It was a great excuse for being late for class. But the train was coming through. We couldn't get across the tracks.
So, so you didn't have a roommate freshman year, and I guess Luann was your roommate. I think we had said that earlier. So, did you miss not having a roommate your freshman year, or did you?
No, I didn't want one. I thought that was a terrible idea. I'd had my own room at home, and I really didn't want to share with somebody else, particularly a woman I didn't know. And then once I had made friends, then it became this would be an okay thing. And so I really didn't care about having my own room after that.
Do you remember any of the visitation policies?
We had them and the men didn't. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I think they had visitation policies too. We had curfews and they didn't last very long because we protested that and then basically said we're just going to ignore it. If the men don't have curfews, we're not going to abide by them either. Visitation, I don't think there was any visitation during the week. But then you had just restricted hours on the weekends when you could have men in the dorm. And you were supposed to have the door open if they were in your room.
Did everyone follow the rules?
No.
In a word.
I would say probably more followed them than did not in the beginning. Once the protest started, then it was just flagrant. We're violating this. We're not paying any attention to it. It's not fair. We shouldn't have different rules than the men on campus. And Mrs. Shack, who was our house mother, was very tolerant and would actually wave and talk to the men as they were headed up the stairs in Mary Branch, and she never reported anybody. She was just a sweet woman. She was like a grandmother to all of us.
So, what was your major, and how did you decide on that?
Well, I started out as a political science major, and then I switched my sophomore year to philosophy. And there were two things that drove that. One, good, and one, not so responsible. I took Intro to Philosophy, and I absolutely loved that course. Dr. Panel was teaching it, and I connected big time to the course. And then the not so good and not so responsible reason for switching was that if you were on the dean's list, you had unlimited cuts from class if you were in the philosophy department. But the political science department didn't care whether you were on the dean's list or not. You still only had 3 cuts a semester. And I didn't think that was fair, and I wanted unlimited ability to cut class if I wanted to. And so that was another driving force for me changing majors.
So you got to cut as many classes as you wanted to? Wow.
Yeah, I actually, there were a number of departments that were like that. And I took a psych class. I can't remember what year it was. It was like intro to psych. I had to do it to meet the requirements of, you got to have a science, you got to have a math, you got to have this. And so I took psych, and I only showed up for class when I showed up the first day, and then I knew what the schedules were for when the exams were, and I showed up for the exams. And virtually just didn't go to class the rest of the time. It happened to be, I mean, it was all straight out of the textbook. So as long as you read the textbook, you really didn't need to be there. And I got an A on the exam, and it got posted as a B. They used to post the grades. You know, after exams, they'd get posted on the professor's office door, and you could go and look and see, okay, you know, what did I get on the exam? What did I get on for the semester? You know, there wasn't any big deal about this is private information. I mean, it was there for anybody to see. And I went by, and he'd given me a B plus, and I went and complained. And he said, well, you never showed up for class. And I said, well, on day one, you said that the grade was going to be based on the two exams. And I got A pluses on both the exams. How can you give me a B plus? Well, you didn't show up for class. And I said, one of the criteria that was supposed to enter into the grade. And he ended up increasing my grade back to an A. But most of the time I did. I went to class. I just probably didn't. 3 cuts a semester was tough.
Are there any other classes that were professors that stand out to you? I guess panel stood out.
Well, Dr. Unger, I mean, he was a very interesting professor. They were probably my 2 favorites. Schuyler Miller. I took astronomy and geology. You had 1 semester of astronomy and 1 of geology. And he was just an incredible professor. And he'd get up in front of the classroom, and he could write backwards. And so he'd stand there at the blackboard and just write backwards across the blackboard. And you're just fascinated with the man. But he's always telling interesting stories. And we would go to the observatory as part of astronomy, and you know, you're learning about the stars in class, and then you were actually over there in the observatory at night, and we had a special project where we had to map the moons around Saturn, moving around Saturn. It was kind of cool. But yeah, he stood out big time. They were probably my most favorite, those 3.
Can you say anything about the first 2? That any qualities that the reason why they stood out to you?
I guess both Unger and Panel, well, same thing with Schuyler Miller. They had such a grasp of their subject matter, and it didn't seem to matter. I mean, they engaged students in the classroom. Neither one of them were the kind of teacher who would single you out. You know, you look like you're trying to avoid answering this question, so I'm going to call on you. They never did that, but they managed to engage virtually everyone in the classroom at some point during each class. And just, you know, the knowledge they had, and they were always there. You know, the doors were always open to their offices. You were welcome anytime to pop in. I mean, Dr. Unger, oh my Lord, he would assign the work. I mean, it was just, he was incredible, the amount of reading that he gave. I can remember, like, Christmas break, going home, and I had 10 books I had to read over Christmas break. It's like, oh, incredible.
How did you feel as a woman in the classroom in all of these classes with all these professors, since there weren't too many of you?
I don't know. We knew that some of the guys didn't like the fact that we were there because we were skewing the grading curves. The women seemed to be at the top of the grading curve pretty consistently. I mean, when you go back and you look at who ended up in Phi Beta Kappa and the other ones, it was the females who kind of outshined things. But I don't feel like I was treated any differently in the classroom, other than, if you had a guy who was clearly excelling, they were getting the same kind of treatment as the females. I mean, you got along better if you were one of the guys. It was okay to excel, but if you were a prissy female that wasn't comfortable around men, you would not have been comfortable at Randolph-Macon back then. You couldn't feel intimidated by being around a bunch of men. And I'll say, that whole experience seemed to carry over in my professional life, even after I graduated. I gravitated to commercial lending in the bank when I was the first female that the bank had hired to do commercial banking, and then gravitated to real estate lending when it was predominantly men doing it. And I've never been intimidated by it, and I think in large part it's because of the way Randolph-Macon was. I mean, yeah, you were surrounded by a bunch of men, but they made you feel like you were part of the group. And it was across the board, the administration, the faculty, the students. There's no question there were some alumni that were upset over the fact that they had let females in and it was no longer an all-male college. But you didn't get that feeling when you were on campus. You felt like you were cherished and loved, and you were part of the family from day one.
Real quick, I forgot to ask you who your advisor was.
I was Dr. Unger my freshman year, and then when I switched majors, it became Dr. Powell.
And I guess you selected them just because they were in your subject, or?
No, we weren't. I don't recall being allowed to select the advisor. I think the advisors were assigned to us. And so it was Unger, I started out saying declaring that I intended to be a political science major. And so he was my advisor. And then when I switched majors, they switched my advisor. But I don't recall as a student being allowed to make that decision. I think the college did it.
Okay, so you said a little bit that you went into commercial banking after you were done with, after you graduated. So did you do anything before that? I guess you maybe, right after you left school?
I took a couple months off before I went to work. But from that point, I started in banking, and I had missed the training program that they hired once a year. I'd actually done on-campus interviews, and then I moved from a little townhouse in Ashland to a rental house up in Doswell, and my mail didn't follow me, and so I didn't know I had been invited back, and missed out on the training program that first year. And the local branch manager said, come work for us. It was First and Merchants back then. It's now part of Bank of America. But the little Ashland local manager said, come on over, I'll hire you as a teller, which will get you in the door, and then you'll have first dibs on next year's management training class. And so I started as a teller and then quickly became an installment loan officer doing car loans and things like that. And then the manager of the Montpelier branch got into some troubles and issues, and he was put on leave, and so they sent me up there to basically take his place on a temporary basis, and I was put into what they called the management trainee program that following June, but there were only 3 of us in that class that year. And then I worked in the branches for a couple of years and then switched over to commercial banking.
So how do you feel, other than the fact that, what you had talked about earlier, how do you feel that, you were a philosophy major, so how do you think that all kind of worked into the rest of, into your career in banking?
I think it gave me an appreciation for a lot of different thought processes and perspectives that people bring to the table. It helped me to think logically, which is something I needed to be able to do in the banking world. And if you're in a customer service area, which I was, that ability to respect diversity, to have it interest you and engage you. When I was calling on lots of different businesses, they weren't all the same line of business. So you were in a manufacturing plant one day, you were in a retail establishment the next, you might be in a hotel the following day, and you needed to have the love of learning and I guess the questioning, so that you could learn, okay, what makes this business tick, to be able to figure out how do I structure a loan, or what products should I bring to the table that are actually going to meet the needs of this client, as opposed to just selling something because the bank wanted you to sell it. And I think all of those traits were probably instilled as a result of the things that I learned in philosophy.
So are you happy that you didn't do business in econ? You
Well, there
instead
wasn't a business major when I was at Randolph-Macon. There was an econ major. I had virtually no interest in being an econ major. I don't know why. The idea of it turned me off. My natural aptitudes are more artistically related, and so I think that's why philosophy maybe attracted me the way it did. Whereas econ was hard business and, too much math and theory that felt like math. And then I end up a banker all my life. What can I say?
It's definitely interesting, the path. So how did you stay in contact with the college after graduation throughout your career?
Well, I was only living a few miles up the road in Doswell, and it was the friendship with Dr. Panel and his wife, Mary Alita, and they'd invite us down to their house for dinner, and I was popping by the college campus on a regular basis and would stop in to see him and see Dr. Unger, Dr. Baskin, who was an economics professor who I liked very much, but he could never convince me to take one of his classes. And so it was Dr. Panel pulling me in, and then Tom Powers, who at the time was head of the nominating committee for the alumni board, who I'm sure it was Dr. Panel who said, give this girl a call, she lives close by, and she loves the college. And Tom Powers called me and said, would you be willing to come serve on the nominating committee? And I think I said, I don't know that many alumni. I don't know any older alumni. And he said, well, you'll learn them being on the nominating committee. And he just, he was a stickler for, if we're having a committee meeting, you need to show up. And so that kept me coming back on, at least 3 times a year. Plus I was living close by. Dr. Panel was bringing me back. And it just never lost those connections. And even after Dr. Panel died, Mary Alita Panel was still around, and she kept the connection going. And after serving on the nominating committee for a while, then they nominated me to serve on the alumni board. And from that point on, it was maybe only a year in between the time I served on the alumni board and then when I served on the board of trustees. there was a year gap in there, not long enough to, lose track of things. And I guess I've been off the trustee board for, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years. Came to the end of my 12 years. I couldn't stay anymore. But there's lots of, Randolph-Macon alums down in this area, and so I'm constantly running into them. And got Mike Carter. Lots of connections still. I think the key is you have to go after the students early. And like in the case with Tom Powers, he didn't have room on the alumni board to put me on the board. And he was also a stickler for, hey, not anybody can just serve on this board. We want some female representatives, but you need to do a little work here for the school before, we're going to elect you to the alumni board. And if you're having trouble with the decades of the 90s, favorite professors that reach out and, keep bringing you back, or people in the administration, that they were working with, coaches. You just have to keep that going, and the sooner you do, the more I think you get them hooked in.
A question I always like to ask is just, obviously you knew we were coming today, you saw the list of questions, but was there anything in particular that we haven't touched on that are special memories, specific stories that we haven't asked a question that would bring you to share those?
Not that I want in an official archive.
Fair enough, that's fine.
You can ask Ira Andrews that question.
I will do that the next time I see
Yeah,
him.
when they, well, I guess it was, I can't remember whether it was when I was president of the Alumni Association, and of course, by virtue of being president, you are also doing a stint as a trustee. And I don't remember whether it was that time or whether it was the second time after I'd had the little hiatus of a year in between boards, but Ira Andrews, who was the Dean of Students when I was a student, and whose office I visited several times as a student for not so great things, he actually took the time to show up, and he stood out in the hallway. The boardroom was where the trustees were meeting in Peel Hall, and he was standing there when I showed up that morning because he knew they were going to induct me onto the Board of Trustees. And he said, I just had to be here. I never thought I'd see the day when we made you a trustee.
That's great.
Yeah, I think we gave both Dean Andrews and Dean Seymour because they decided they needed a woman dean, but Dean Andrews was the one who was pretty much running the show, and I never was in Dean Seymour's office, but I was in Dean Andrews a couple of times.
If you,
I know, sure. A question I sometimes ask, if someone else doesn't, is, do you have, sort of in hindsight, in retrospect, do you have advice you would give, in particular, a female Randolph-Macon student who's on the campus today, or, by extension, any student, of how maybe they should, or what they could do to make that experience as full as it possibly could be?
Spend time with your professors outside of the classroom. There were a number of them that used to hang out in the PX. They'd go there for coffee in between morning classes.
What is it?
The PX. Well, you had the old gym, and then you had Mary Branch. And I know this isn't going to show up on there, but for your benefit, then there was this little one-story block of a building because we didn't have the Brown Campus Center, and there was a kitchen in there. and there were tables, and you could go when the cafeteria was closed and in between meals. The PX was always open, and you could go and you could get hamburgers late at night or drinks. And the faculty, there were a number of them that would congregate in the PX, for coffee in the morning. And you were welcome as a student to join them at the table and engage in, conversation with them. And, they'd be out and about on the campus. And I would just say, if you allowed that engagement to occur, it definitely enriched your life a great deal. And I would tell anybody to do that. Don't just assume that the professor is only there as a learning experience in the classroom. And probably, just looking back on it from a personal standpoint, I wish I had spent more time studying and less time partying.
Is there anything else that you would like to share today?
No, there's nothing that off the top of my head. It was a great experience. I love the school. As I said, I have always felt that I got far more from Randolph-Macon than I've given back to the school. And I truly think there's something there that you just can't quite put into words until you're actually there and you're on the campus. But Randolph-Macon is like a big family. It's just been a tremendous support mechanism for me for all my life. I love it, and I value the liberal arts education, and I think there is still tremendous value in a liberal arts education today. It kind of makes you a more well-rounded person, and you have a ton more flexibility when you get out into the marketplace, because you are able to look at this job or that job and find a way to fit into it. That somebody who's just majored in maybe business or, some of those engineering, they're just not as well-rounded people, I don't think, as a liberal arts major.
Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
We
Thank you.
enjoy it.